Hi, Lou here with the second part of On the Horns of a Dilemma. First, I'm going to talk about some types of games, quote unquote, what some people call games, which some other people might not call games. First of all, we have the long traditional game, which is a game with human opposition. The real divide in games is not tabletop versus video, it's human opposition versus the game system. Whether the game system is a computer or other programmed opposition or just the situation. Then we have parallel competitions where there's no human opposition, though other humans are involved. In other words, multiplayer solitaire. And then we have races. And of course, there are many games that are in between these things. Few games are at an extreme. So first, games with human opposition. Even video games can involve losing when there's human opposition, but you have to have the capability of losing or failing in order to have a game with human opposition. Now, you need another human as well, of course. But some games where there are other humans, you can lose a session, but you never lose the entire game. So World of Tanks and MOBAs, you can lose a session, but you still gain in the long run. You can play World of Tanks and lose every battle and get your tank blasted and still end up with more than you had to start with. You could, and always would, lose an arcade game, even without human opposition. So it's not just about losing and winning, it's about how you're defeated. In a parallel competition, the competitors cannot directly influence, within the rules, one another's performance. So you have many Olympic sports such as diving, traditional speed skating, figure skating, traditional downhill, even weightlifting. Those are all parallel competitions. Any activity that can be measured in some way can be turned into a parallel competition, which is often called a game, but it's not a game in the old sense. For example, you can have a contest to see who can type fastest, who can throw something the farthest, who can pitch a penny closest to a wall, who can eat the most hot dogs in a certain amount of time. Those are all parallel competitions. In many cases, there are several solutions that always work in a parallel competition, which in Euro-style board games are called paths to victory. Often, everyone knows what to do, and whoever executes best wins. Think especially of Olympic games. Everybody knows that you have to run the fastest, but somebody executes that best and wins. When video game players compare scores in a game or the time to beat the game, they're trying to engage in a parallel competition. Notice there's very little game design in a pure parallel competition. At most, there's puzzle design in the activity. What about parallel competitions versus racing? Well, parallel competitions can be conducted sequentially, as in figure skating, or simultaneously, as in marathons and swimming, which is what we usually call races. But some races are parallel competitions and some aren't. A parallel competition where players can cooperate to succeed or can hinder the others becomes a race. For example, in auto racing, a driver can block another from passing, or in NASCAR races, the driver can tap his opponent's rear end to get him out of the way, or he can aid another car by drafting. That's a race, not quite a parallel competition. Although, in most respects, it's still a parallel competition. What about MMOs? MMOs have mostly gone from subscription to free to play. Free to play almost inevitably becomes play for reward because the people who run the MMOs have to keep those people subscribing. Now, EVE Online, for example, stays subscription because it's human versus human, without save games to fall back on, but that's an exception. Most F2P are free to play. So I'm going to quote from Chris Thurston in PC Magazine from quite a long time ago now, April 2014. MMO orthodoxy says that a player challenged is a player lost, and so developers smooth out the curves on their roller coasters. It's not quite a challenge anymore, which traditional games were. Now, there's been a resurgence of difficulty, perhaps, against the general trend in video games of games getting easier and easier to succeed at. In roguelike games, for example, although even there you can figure out where the save game is saved and still go back to your save game. It's just more complicated. MOBAs, though you still can't lose in the long run, you can lose in individual fights. Old school fantasy role-playing tabletop players. But players of these games are heavily outnumbered by the pure entertainment reward-based players. Is this change merely because of video game publishers seeking the mass market? That's certainly happening, but that's not a cause. You could ask, how much is Zynga's fault? Zinger was the original big-time game maker for Facebook. But if you ever played any Zinger games, and I had to for obscure reasons, they were puzzles and they sort of told you what to do next anyway. I don't think it was Zynga's fault. I think they took advantage of what was already there, but overdid it. This change from having to earn what you get to being rewarded for participation is part of the 21st century zeitgeist. And parallel competitions are a reflection of that in tabletop games. Now, too much like work. I stopped playing chess 50 years ago because it was too much like work. The centuries of analysis became a barrier. You had to learn all these analyses to play because you were playing against other people who'd learned those analyses. Also, it's a puzzle, though one too complicated to be completely solved by humans, and I prefer games that don't have always right solutions like puzzles. Now, what's happened in the age of instant gratification and convenience is many players aren't willing to work much at any game. They don't want to earn something, they want to be rewarded for participation. They've been taught this in K-12 schools for years, at least in the United States, and for a while in the United Kingdom. What about frustration? Many people don't want a challenge in their entertainments. What was acceptable frustration in a game 40 years ago often is not nowadays. Many players want something like an interactive movie or TV show rather than what we used to call a game. Movies don't require hard decisions. A game of hard decisions requires the player to use his brain. But using your brain seems to be going out of fashion in all aspects of life. So where an old guy like me was willing to work in most games, though not in chess, a young person may not be willing. What about fairness? Traditionally, fairness was important to game players. Now, not so much. Think of collectible card games. You spend more money, you get better cards, you succeed. Now, CCG tournaments have found a way around this, but in ordinary play, that's not the case. In East Asia, the tradition is games are for showing off. They don't have to be fair. Think about free-to-play games where you have cosmetic versus functional advantages in the stuff that you can buy. For example, the premium ammo in World of Tanks gives you a functional advantage, where Team Fortress has managed to sell hats that are purely cosmetic, but that's very much an exception. When kids say, that's not fair, they often mean, that isn't what I like or want. And modern video games try to deliver what they like. And it's happening in tabletop games as well. So where does this leave designers, game designers? It is what it is. The game industry can't change it. You can't change it. You can design for the old style players to a niche market, PC and tablet platforms especially, and tabletop war games, or you can try to find ways for the reward-based and consequence-based gamers to coexist. In free-to-play, we do have a few games like Team Fortress where the additions are only cosmetic, but of course that's a two-player game, essentially two sides. In World of Tanks, perhaps you have different tiers of play, but it's a very difficult problem. Or you can focus on something other than gameplay depth. Puzzle depth appeals to many, especially abstract gamers. Story depth is becoming more and more popular. The game is more like a movie. Model depth can appeal, but I think liking a model tends to go along with liking gameplay depth. And in practice, people are trying to escape or ignore reality more and more in the West. Or maybe you can do something more creative. For example, an autopilot mode in a video game so that those who don't want to make significant decisions can let the computer play through such parts. And then they can take over again. The old-time players can still play their way through. We already have movies that are much like video games. Why not have video games that can be played as though they were movies? Now, that's a lot to absorb. You may disagree with me. This is a result of my experience. Things really do change over time, and people change their preferences. A lot of young people think things are the way they've always been, and it's not true. It's too big for designers to change anything, though. These are trends, cultural trends, and worldwide trends. Thanks for listening.